The Opium Wars were a pivotal crucible in modern history, forging the fate of nations and shaping the global balance of power. Sparked by Britain's insatiable demand for Chinese goods and China's refusal to open its doors, this conflict would leave an indelible mark on the world. The ashes of war would ignite a century of transformation, forever altering the destiny of empires. In the early 19th century, the Qing dynasty, which had ruled China since 1644, stood as a formidable and isolated empire, its doors narrowly ajar to the outside world. The Chinese economy, fueled by a vast population and a sophisticated system of agriculture, manufacturing, and trade, had long been the envy of European nations. Britain, in particular, with its burgeoning industrial revolution and insatiable appetite for luxury goods such as silk, porcelain, and tea, found itself increasingly dependent on Chinese exports. The British East India Company, a behemoth of mercantile power, had dominated the Indian subcontinent and was now seeking to expand its reach into the lucrative Chinese market. However, the Qing dynasty's restrictive trade policies, which limited European access to a single port, Canton, now Guangzhou, and imposed strict regulations on the types and quantities of goods that could be traded, severely curtailed British ambitions. The Chinese authorities, wary of foreign influence and determined to maintain their cultural and economic sovereignty, carefully controlled the flow of trade, allowing only a select few European merchants to operate within the tightly regulated framework of the Canton system. As the demand for Chinese goods continued to soar, Britain found itself facing a significant trade deficit, with large quantities of silver being drained from its coffers to pay for the coveted exports. The British government and merchant class grew increasingly frustrated with the Qing dynasty's intransigence, seeking ways to redress the balance of trade and gain greater access to the Chinese market. It was against this backdrop of economic tension and cultural mistrust that a new and highly profitable commodity began to emerge as a potential game-changer in the Sino-British trade equation: opium. Grown in vast quantities in British India, opium had long been used for medicinal and recreational purposes in China, but its consumption had been strictly regulated by the Qing authorities. However, as the 18th century drew to a close, the British East India Company, seeking to exploit the lucrative Chinese market, began to aggressively promote the sale of Indian opium in China, often using clandestine means to circumvent Qing regulations. The consequences of this fateful decision would be far-reaching and devastating, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the outbreak of war between Britain and China. In 1793, the British government, under the leadership of Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, sent a diplomatic mission to China, led by Lord George Macartney, with the aim of negotiating a new trade agreement and securing greater access to the Chinese market. The mission, which included a large retinue of scientists, artists, and merchants, was equipped with an array of impressive gifts, including telescopes, clocks, and other examples of British technological prowess. However, despite the fanfare surrounding the mission's arrival in Beijing, the Qing court, under the rule of the Qianlong Emperor, remained unmoved by British overtures, refusing to countenance any significant expansion of trade or diplomatic relations. As the Macartney mission departed China in 1794, it marked a significant turning point in Sino-British relations, with the Qing court's refusal to engage with British overtures, leaving a sense of frustration and disappointment among the British delegation. The failure of the mission to secure greater access to the Chinese market or negotiate a new trade agreement only served to heighten tensions between the two nations, as Britain's desire for Chinese goods continued to grow unabated. In the years that followed, the British East India Company intensified its efforts to promote the sale of Indian opium in China, often using clandestine means to circumvent Qing regulations and evade detection by Chinese authorities. One notable figure who played a key role in this endeavor was James Matheson, a Scottish merchant who had risen through the ranks of the British East India Company to become one of its most influential traders. Matheson, who would later co-found the prominent trading house Jardine, Matheson and Company, was instrumental in establishing a network of smugglers and traders who worked to introduce large quantities of Indian opium into China, often using bribes and other forms of corruption to facilitate their activities. As the opium trade expanded, it began to attract the attention of other European powers, including the French and the Americans, who sought to capitalize on the lucrative market for themselves. Meanwhile, within China, the Qing court was growing increasingly concerned about the spread of opium addiction, which was beginning to have a devastating impact on Chinese society. In 1799, the Jiaqing emperor, who had succeeded the Qianlong emperor in 1796, issued a decree banning the importation and sale of opium and imposing harsh penalties on those caught smuggling or trading in the drug. However, despite these efforts, the opium trade continued to flourish, with corrupt officials and merchants often turning a blind eye to the illicit activities of European traders. As tensions between Britain and China continued to escalate, a new British government, led by Prime Minister Lord Liverpool, began to take a more aggressive stance towards the Qing dynasty. In 1816, the British government sent a second diplomatic mission to China, led by Lord Amherst, with the aim of negotiating a new trade agreement and securing greater access to the Chinese market. However, like the Macartney mission before it, the Amherst mission was met with resistance from the Qing court, which remained determined to maintain its restrictive trade policies and protect Chinese sovereignty. The failure of the Amherst mission marked a significant shift in British policy towards China, as the British government began to consider more coercive measures to achieve its goals. In 1820, the British East India Company's monopoly on the Chinese trade was abolished, opening up the market to other British merchants and traders. This move was followed by a significant increase in British trade with China, including the export of Indian opium, which continued to flow into China despite the Qing court's efforts to suppress it. As the opium trade expanded, it set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the outbreak of war between Britain and China, a conflict that would have far-reaching consequences for both nations and reshape the course of modern history. In the midst of this escalating tensions, a notable event took place in 1821 when the British ship, the Topaz, arrived in Canton carrying a cargo of Indian opium. The ship's captain, a seasoned trader named Charles Elliot, would later play a significant role in the events leading up to the Opium Wars. The Topaz was one of many ships that were smuggling opium into China, and its arrival marked the beginning of a new era of tension between British traders and Chinese authorities. As the Qing court struggled to maintain control over the flow of opium into China, it became increasingly clear that the situation was spiraling out of control and that a major conflict was looming on the horizon. As the Topaz and other British ships continued to smuggle opium into China, the Qing court's efforts to suppress the trade became increasingly desperate. In 1822, the Chinese authorities launched a series of crackdowns on opium dens and smuggling operations in Canton, resulting in the arrest and execution of several prominent Chinese merchants and officials accused of complicity in the trade. However, these measures only served to drive the opium trade further underground, with British traders and their Chinese collaborators adapting to the new reality by using more sophisticated methods to evade detection. One notable example of this cat-and-mouse game was the rise of the fast crabs, a fleet of small, swift ships that could outrun Chinese patrol vessels and deliver their cargo of opium to secluded coves and hidden beaches along the Chinese coast. These ships, often crewed by experienced sailors and smugglers, played a crucial role in maintaining the flow of opium into China, despite the Qing court's best efforts to interdict them. The fast crabs were typically owned and operated by British trading houses such as Jardine, Matheson and Company, which had established itself as one of the leading players in the Chinese opium trade. As the opium trade continued to expand, it began to attract the attention of other European powers, including the French and the Americans. In 1825, the French East India Company established a trading post in Canton with the aim of challenging British dominance in the Chinese market. The Americans, too, were increasingly active in the region, with merchants such as Samuel Russell and his firm, Russell and Company, establishing themselves as major players in the opium trade. This influx of new competitors only served to further destabilize the situation, as British traders and their allies found themselves facing increased competition for control of the lucrative Chinese market. Meanwhile, within China, the Qing court was struggling to maintain its authority in the face of growing internal unrest and external pressure. In 1820, the Daoguang emperor had succeeded the Jiaqing emperor, bringing a new sense of urgency and determination to the task of suppressing the opium trade. However, despite his best efforts, the emperor found himself facing opposition from within his own court, as well as from the powerful regional governors and military commanders who often had their own interests and agendas. One notable example of this internal conflict was the rivalry between the Daoguang Emperor and his powerful minister, the Viceroy of Canton, who was accused of being corrupt and complicit in the opium trade. The Viceroy, who controlled a significant portion of the Chinese army and had considerable influence over the regional governors, was seen as a major obstacle to the emperor's efforts to suppress the opium trade. As tensions between the emperor and the viceroy continued to escalate, it became clear that the Qing court was facing a major crisis of authority and legitimacy, one that would have far-reaching consequences for the future of China. In 1829, the Daoguang Emperor appointed a new Governor-General of Canton, a man named Deng Tingzhen, who was tasked with cracking down on the opium trade and restoring order to the region. However, despite his best efforts, Governor-General Deng found himself facing significant opposition from British traders and their Chinese allies, who were determined to maintain their control over the lucrative opium market. As the situation continued to deteriorate, it became clear that a major confrontation was looming between the Qing court and the British, one that would have far-reaching consequences for both nations and reshape the course of modern history. As Governor-General Deng Tingzhen struggled to assert his authority over the opium trade in Canton, he found himself facing opposition not only from British traders but also from corrupt Chinese officials who had grown wealthy from bribes and kickbacks. However, these efforts were ultimately unsuccessful, as the opium trade continued to thrive, with British traders adapting to the new reality by using more sophisticated methods to evade detection. One notable example of this cat-and-mouse game was the rise of the lorcha, a type of ship that combined European and Chinese designs, allowing it to navigate the treacherous waters of the Pearl River Delta with ease. The lorcha was typically crewed by a mix of Chinese and European sailors who worked together to smuggle opium into China, often using bribes and other forms of corruption to facilitate their activities. The lorchas were highly maneuverable and could outrun Chinese patrol vessels, making them a formidable force in the opium trade. In 1834, the British government, under the leadership of Prime Minister Lord Grey, began to take a more aggressive stance towards the Qing dynasty. As tensions between Britain and China continued to escalate, a new player entered the scene, the British Superintendent of Trade in Canton, Captain Charles Elliot. Elliot, who had previously served as the captain of the Topaz, was a seasoned trader and diplomat who understood the complexities of the opium trade and the Qing court's opposition to it. In 1835, Elliot was appointed by the British government to oversee British trade in China and to negotiate with the Qing court on behalf of British merchants. Elliot's arrival in Canton marked a significant shift in British policy towards China, as he began to take a more aggressive stance towards the Qing court, demanding greater access to the Chinese market and an end to the restrictive trade policies that had long limited British commerce. However, despite his best efforts, Elliot found himself facing opposition not only from the Qing court but also from British traders who were determined to maintain their control over the lucrative opium market. In 1836, the Daoguang Emperor appointed a new commissioner, Lin Zexu, to oversee the suppression of the opium trade in Canton. Commissioner Lin was a seasoned official who had previously served as the governor of Jiangsu province and was known for his strict adherence to Qing law and tradition. Commissioner Lin's arrival in Canton marked a significant turning point in the history of the opium trade, as he began to take drastic measures to suppress the trade and restore order to the region. In June 1839, Commissioner Lin ordered the confiscation of all opium stocks in Canton, resulting in the seizure of over 20,000 chests of opium from British warehouses. The move was a major blow to British traders, who had long relied on the opium trade as a lucrative source of revenue. As the British government and merchants responded with outrage to Commissioner Lin's actions, it became clear that a major conflict was looming between the Qing court and the British. In August 1839, the British government sent a fleet of warships to Canton, under the command of Admiral George Elliot, who was tasked with negotiating with Commissioner Lin and securing the release of the confiscated opium. As Admiral George Elliot's fleet arrived in Canton, Commissioner Lin Zexu remained resolute in his determination to suppress the opium trade. The British demand for the release of the confiscated opium was met with a firm refusal, and Lin instead proposed that the British traders sign a bond promising not to engage in the opium trade in the future. However, this proposal was rejected by the British, who saw it as an attempt to undermine their commercial interests. The situation continued to escalate, and on September 4, 1839, a group of British sailors clashed with Chinese soldiers in the town of Kowloon, resulting in the death of a Chinese officer. The incident sparked outrage among the British community, and Admiral Elliot demanded that Commissioner Lin take action to punish those responsible. However, Lin refused, arguing that the British had been the aggressors. Tensions continued to rise, and on November 3, 1839, the British fleet sailed up the Pearl River, intent on blockading the port of Canton. The Qing Navy, however, was poorly equipped to respond, and the British were able to establish a blockade with relative ease. The blockade had a devastating impact on the city of Canton, which relied heavily on trade for its survival. As the blockade continued, Commissioner Lin became increasingly isolated, and his position within the Qing court began to weaken. In January 1840, the Daoguang Emperor appointed a new official, Qishan, to oversee the negotiations with the British. Qishan was a more conciliatory figure than Lin, and he quickly set about trying to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis. However, the British were in no mood for compromise, and they continued to press their demands for greater access to the Chinese market and an end to the restrictive trade policies that had long limited British commerce. In June 1840, a British fleet arrived off the coast of Tianjin, near Beijing, and threatened to attack the city unless the Qing government agreed to negotiate. The Qing government, realizing that it was no match for the British militarily, reluctantly agreed to negotiate. The resulting treaty, known as the Convention of Quenpi, was signed on January 20, 1841, and provided for the opening of several Chinese ports to British trade, including Canton, Shanghai, and Ningpo. The treaty also established a system of tariffs and regulations that would govern British trade in China. However, the Convention of Quenpi was short-lived, as the Qing government soon realized that it had made significant concessions without gaining any meaningful benefits. In March 1841, the Daoguang Emperor repudiated the treaty, and Qishan was dismissed from his position for his role in negotiating the agreement. The British, feeling that they had been betrayed, responded with force, and on May 25, 1841, they launched an attack on the city of Canton. The Qing forces were quickly overwhelmed, and the city was occupied by the British. The fall of Canton marked a significant turning point in the Opium Wars, as it demonstrated the military superiority of the British and paved the way for further British expansion into China. As the British consolidated their control over Canton, they began to look towards other parts of China, seeking to expand their influence and secure new trade opportunities. In August 1841, a British fleet sailed up the Yangtze River, intent on capturing the city of Nanjing, which was then the capital of the Qing dynasty's southern provinces. The British faced significant resistance as they advanced up the river, but ultimately they were able to overcome the Qing forces and capture the city of Zhenjiang, which controlled access to the Grand Canal. The fall of Zhenjiang gave the British a strategic advantage, as it allowed them to threaten the city of Nanjing and ultimately force the Qing government to negotiate. The resulting treaty, known as the Treaty of Nanjing, was signed on August 29, 1842, and marked the end of the First Opium War. The treaty provided for the opening of several Chinese ports to British trade, including Shanghai, Ningpo, and Fuzhou, and established a system of tariffs and regulations that would govern British trade in China. It also ceded the island of Hong Kong to Britain, which would become a major center for British trade and commerce in East Asia. As the Treaty of Nanjing was signed, the Qing government was forced to confront the reality of its weakened position. The treaty's provisions, including the opening of Chinese ports to British trade and the cession of Hong Kong, marked a significant shift in the balance of power between China and the Western powers. The British, emboldened by their military victory, began to exert greater pressure on the Qing government to comply with the treaty's terms. One of the key figures in the implementation of the Treaty of Nanjing was Sir Henry Pottinger, the British plenipotentiary who had negotiated the agreement. Pottinger, a seasoned diplomat and administrator, was tasked with overseeing the establishment of British trade relations with China and ensuring that the Qing government adhered to the treaty's provisions. He worked closely with Chinese officials, including the Governor-General of Canton, to facilitate the opening of Chinese ports to British trade and to establish a system of tariffs and regulations that would govern British commerce in China. As the British began to consolidate their position in China, they faced opposition from various quarters. Many Chinese officials and merchants were resistant to the idea of foreign trade and resented the privileges granted to the British under the Treaty of Nanjing. The Qing government meanwhile struggled to maintain its authority in the face of internal unrest and external pressure. The Taiping Rebellion, a massive civil war that would eventually claim millions of lives, was already simmering in the southern provinces, and the Qing government's ability to respond effectively to the crisis was hindered by its weakened state. Despite these challenges, the British continued to push forward with their plans for expanding trade with China. In 1843, Pottinger established a British consulate in Shanghai, which quickly became a major center for British commerce in East Asia. The consulate played a key role in facilitating trade between Britain and China, and its officials worked closely with Chinese merchants and officials to promote British interests. As the British consolidated their position in Shanghai, they also began to explore other parts of China. In 1844, a British expedition led by Sir John Davis, the governor of Hong Kong, sailed up the Yangtze River to the city of Wuhan, where they engaged in negotiations with local officials over trade and commerce. The expedition marked the beginning of a new phase of British expansion into China, as the British sought to establish themselves as a major power in East Asia. The Qing government, meanwhile, was struggling to come to terms with the implications of the Treaty of Nanjing. The treaty's provisions had exposed the weaknesses of the Qing state and highlighted its inability to resist foreign pressure. In response, the Qing government began to implement a series of reforms aimed at strengthening its military and administrative capabilities. The reforms, which included the establishment of a new army and the modernization of the Qing bureaucracy, were designed to enable the Qing government to better resist foreign encroachment and maintain its authority over Chinese society. One of the key figures in the Qing government's reform efforts was Wei Yuan, a scholar official who had served as an advisor to the Daoguang Emperor. Wei, who was deeply concerned about the implications of the Treaty of Nanjing for China's sovereignty, advocated for a series of reforms aimed at strengthening the Qing state and promoting Chinese industry and commerce. His ideas, which included the establishment of a modern navy and the development of Chinese manufacturing capabilities, would eventually influence a generation of Chinese reformers and play a significant role in shaping China's response to the challenges posed by Western imperialism. As the Qing government struggled to implement its reforms, the British continued to push forward with their plans for expanding trade with China. The negotiations between the British and Chinese officials were complex and often contentious, reflecting the deep-seated tensions and mistrust that existed between the two sides. The British, who were determined to secure greater access to Chinese markets and resources, were willing to use military force to achieve their objectives if necessary. The Chinese, meanwhile, were deeply concerned about the implications of foreign trade for their sovereignty and way of life, and they resisted British pressure with a mixture of diplomacy and force. As the negotiations between the British and Chinese officials continued, tensions remained high, with both sides dug in on their respective positions. The British were determined to secure greater access to Chinese markets and resources, while the Chinese were resolute in their opposition to foreign trade and influence. In 1846, the British government appointed Sir John Davis as the new governor of Hong Kong, with instructions to pursue a more aggressive policy towards China. Davis, a seasoned diplomat and administrator, was well suited to the task. He quickly set about establishing a strong British presence in southern China, using a combination of diplomacy and military force to achieve his objectives. In 1847, he led a British expedition to the city of Canton, where he demanded that the Chinese authorities open up the city to British trade and commerce. The Chinese, however, refused to yield, and the situation remained deadlocked. Meanwhile, the Qing government was facing growing internal unrest as the Taiping Rebellion continued to spread throughout southern China. The rebellion, which had begun in 1850, was a massive civil war that would eventually claim millions of lives and weaken the Qing state to the point of collapse. As the rebellion raged on, the Qing government found itself increasingly unable to resist foreign pressure, and the British took advantage of this weakness to push their claims. In 1856, the British launched a second war against China, known as the Second Opium War. The war was sparked by a dispute over the registration of a British ship, the Arrow, which had been seized by Chinese authorities in Canton. The British used the incident as a pretext to launch a full-scale attack on China, with the aim of securing greater concessions and opening up the country to foreign trade. The Second Opium War was marked by a series of brutal and one-sided conflicts, as the British used their superior military power to overwhelm Chinese resistance. In 1857, British forces captured the city of Canton, and in 1858, they occupied the city of Tianjin, which is located near Beijing. The Qing government, realizing that it was no match for the British militarily, was forced to sign the Treaty of Tianjin, which granted the British significant concessions, including the opening up of several Chinese ports to foreign trade. The Treaty of Tianjin was followed by the Convention of Beijing, which was signed in 1860. The convention marked the end of the Second Opium War and established a new era of foreign domination in China. The British, along with other Western powers, including France and the United States, were granted significant privileges and concessions, including the right to establish diplomatic missions in Beijing and to trade freely in Chinese ports. As the Qing government struggled to come to terms with the implications of the Treaty of Tianjin and the Convention of Beijing, the country was plunged into a period of chaos and upheaval. The Taiping Rebellion continued to rage on, and the Qing state was weakened to the point of collapse. In 1861, the Qing government was forced to establish a new foreign affairs ministry known as the Zhongli Yamen, which was responsible for managing China's relations with foreign powers. The Zhongli Yamen was headed by Prince Gong, a member of the Qing royal family who had been appointed to oversee China's foreign policy. Prince Gong, who was a pragmatic and forward-thinking leader, recognized that China needed to adapt to the changing circumstances of the modern world. He set about establishing a new system of foreign relations based on the principles of equality and reciprocity, and he worked to promote Chinese trade and commerce with foreign countries. Despite these efforts, however, the Qing government continued to face significant challenges, both at home and abroad. The Taiping Rebellion finally came to an end in 1864. But the country was left devastated and weakened. The Qing state was also facing growing pressure from foreign powers, including Japan, which had recently been opened up to foreign trade and commerce. In 1874, Japan launched a war against China, known as the First Sino-Japanese War, which resulted in the loss of Taiwan to Japan. The First Sino-Japanese War marked the beginning of a new era of foreign domination in China, as the country was forced to confront the reality of its weakened state. The Qing government, which had once been the dominant power in East Asia, was now struggling to survive, and the country was plunged into a period of chaos and upheaval. In 1911, the Qing dynasty finally came to an end, as a republican revolution led by Sun Yat-sen overthrew the imperial system and established a new government in China. The fall of the Qing dynasty marked the end of a long and complex era in Chinese history, which had been shaped by the interactions between China and foreign powers. The Opium Wars, which had begun in the 1840s, had played a significant role in shaping this era, as they had forced China to confront the reality of its weakened state and had led to the establishment of a new system of foreign relations. As China looked to the future, it was clear that the country would continue to face significant challenges, both at home and abroad. But it was also clear that the Chinese people were determined to rebuild and strengthen their nation, and to secure a place for themselves in the modern world. The Opium Wars stand as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of imperialism and the enduring legacy of foreign domination in China. The conflicts marked a pivotal moment in Chinese history, forcing the country to confront its weaknesses and ultimately paving the way for the downfall of the Qing dynasty. The Opium Wars may be a chapter in the past, but their impact continues to shape the present, serving as a powerful reminder of the importance of understanding and learning from our collective history. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.